This is a video that many have asked for, or at least one person asked for over and over again. So, let's get into another Shadows of the Unmade with David Fincher's canceled projects. We have a lot to get through, so let's just cut to the chase and head right in. For the 1990s, the first film we have is Love Field. In April of 1990, the LA Times reported that David Fincher, at this point only known for directing music videos, was going to make his feature debut with Love Field, which was based on a stage play about Jack Ruby, the man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald. However, due to unknown reasons, Fincher withdrew from the film and was replaced by John Mackenzie. The film would then be changed to Ruby and released in 1992, where it received mixed to negative reviews and unfairly compared to the much more popular and mainstream hit JFK, directed by Oliver Stone. The next film is Madonna, Truth or Dare. Fincher was considered to direct the documentary based on Madonna after directing 3 of her music videos at the time, but he and Madonna had a falling out, so he was replaced by Alec Kasheshian, who completely changed the idea of the project, going from a concert film to a full-on documentary. It was heavily praised outside of a Worst Actress Razzie for Madonna, and was the highest grossing documentary ever made, until Bowling for Columbine in 2002. Now we have the next film with The Avengers, the British TV show adaptation, not the, incredibly popular superhero group. When the film was being made in the late 1990s, Fincher was one of the directors considered. He wanted to make it a quote-unquote big, widescreen, black and white version, kind of cool, a real mod 60s kind of thing, and wanted Charles Dance for John Steed. The film would eventually be helmed by Jeremiah S. Chechik, who would pick Ray Fiennes for Steed. Due to the amount of production problems and studio interference, it would be a colossal failure and end the directing career for Chechik. From one British spy franchise to another with GoldenEye, or what would become GoldenEye, Fincher stated he was in discussions to direct the first post-Timothy Dalton Bond film. After his work on Alien 3, he wanted to do something unique and different, but that the Broccolis at the time knew what they wanted with the franchise, which would ironically and eventually lead to the lackluster output of the Brosnan era. Believe me, they didn't want to hear from me. The people that own that franchise have a pretty good idea of what they think it is. That was my problem with Alien 3. I wanted to do something that nobody else wanted to do. They kept hoping that I was going to change my mind, and I kept hoping they would appreciate where we were going, and it ended up being a bloodbath. The film would eventually nab Martin Campbell for the director's chair, Brosnan for Bond, and eventually become the film GoldenEye, one of the most revered Bond films of all time and considered the best and really the only good Brosnan film by fans. The next one is certainly a surprise, and that is Blade. Yes, that Blade. In a 2022 interview, David S. Goyer actually revealed that Fincher was not only considered or in discussions, but was actually going to direct the film that would come out in 1998. After Seven, which was in 1995, Goyer said he straight up developed the script with Fincher. It is unknown why he bowed out, but Goyer claimed that Fincher was going to direct and basically co-write the script with him after initially pitching the film with director Ernest Dickerson. Stephen Norrington would then go on to direct the film to positive reviews and a sizable box office, while Fincher would go on to direct The Game with Michael Douglas to also good reviews and a decent box office. The next project is definitely a smaller one with the TV series Fallen Angels. Just before the film Seven was greenlit, Fincher was going to direct an episode of the neo-noir anthology crime series Fallen Angels for Season 2 specifically. It's unknown which episode he was going to direct, but he would obviously direct 7 instead. Next up is The Sky is Falling. Fincher had talks to do the film for TriStar. The script was written by Howard Roth and Eric Warren Singer, and it was about 2 religious leaders who are on an archaeological dig who find proof of God. The film would never be greenlit as it was only a spec script. The next one we have is The Crowded Room. It was a film in development hell for a while, based on the novel The Minds of Billy Milligan. He considered directing it with Brad Pitt starring, but it remained in development hell until it was adapted into a mini-series in 2023 with Akiva Goldsman at the helm, where it received overwhelming negative reviews. The next film was surprisingly Chicago, as in the musical, in 2002. Nothing really all that major, just that he was approached to direct and it is assumed he turned it down. But considering he was good with grounded crime dramas but also directed music videos, I could honestly see it. Rob Marshall would direct the film instead, where it would go on to win the Best Picture Oscar of that year and nab several other awards. Now we have a very big one. Rendezvous with Rama. In mid-1997, Fincher was attached to direct the adaptation of the Arthur C. Clarke novel of the same name. Morgan Freeman wanted to produce the film with his production company, Revelations Entertainment, and star in the film as Commander Norton. In 2001, it was still stated he was set to direct, and once again confirmed it in 2007. However, in late 2008, Fincher said it was unlikely to ever get made because they didn't have a script, and it was stated that Freeman was not in the best of health at that point. In 2010, Freeman reiterated the sentiments of not being able to find the right script and wanted to make the best film possible, and the trouble was finding the right script for it. He also wanted to make it a 3D film. A year later, Fincher reiterated he wanted to make the film and was planning to do so after his 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea remake, which never saw the light of day and we will get into soon enough, and once again echoed the complications of finding a good script. A year after that, Morgan Freeman was doing an interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson and stated he wanted to play Norton in the film and said it was a dream to play the character and command the Endeavor, the starship in the novel. Tyson then said, "So is this a pitch to be that person if they ever make that movie?" And Freeman replied, "We are going to make the movie," and said he wanted to make it come out sooner rather than later, and once again stated that the difficulty finding a really good script. The only task you have that's really hard in making movies, harder than getting money, is getting a script. A good script. When doing an interview with Empire, Fincher described the film as a gigantic, expensive movie that didn't have any toys. Almost a decade after Freeman's interview with Tyson, it seems like the film might get made, but like a common thread with most of these films, without Fincher's involvement. In December 2021, it was set to be in development at Alcon Entertainment with Denis Villeneuve to direct. Freeman and Laurie McCreary are on the production team due to them owning the rights initially. Broderick Johnson and Andrew Kozov will produce the film. The most recent news was from early last year that Denis Villeneuve is writing the script, which probably won't be done until he's finished with his Dune trilogy, as Dune Messiah is set to come out next year. The next film I have is called The Night Watchman. In November of 1997, David Fincher was getting ready to direct his magnum opus, Fight Club, but Brad Pitt's negotiations were taking too long, so he wanted to direct another movie in the meantime, which was called The Night Watchman. The script was by James Ellroy. The plans for this fell through, and he would go on to direct Fight Club next anyway. The film was then going to be helmed by Spike Lee, until directing duties went to David Ayer. Kurt Wimmer and Jamie Moss also did rewrites on the script. It would eventually be released as Street Kings in 2005, with Keanu Reeves starring. It received negative reviews. Speaking of James Ellroy, the next project we have is The Black Dahlia. After the James Ellroy novel came out in 1987, James B. Harris optioned the rights for the novel, who wanted to direct the adaptation himself. However, he abandoned it when he wanted to direct other things. It was in development hell for many years until the highly successful and critically acclaimed LA Confidential came out in 1997, which was another famous Ellroy novel. So this had many studios wanting to take a crack at Black Dahlia. Universal eventually bought the rights to the novel shortly after LA Confidential came out. Josh Friedman, who only had a story credit to Chain Reaction to his name at this point, was hired to write the script, and he claimed to have worked on it from 1997 to 2005. His script featured cameo appearances from Bud White and Edmund Exley, who would be played by Pierce and Crow again, respectively. David Fincher soon became attached to the project in 1998. Ellroy approved of this after his work on Seven. He originally envisioned it as a 5-hour-long miniseries with an $80 million budget, with major film actors, having Tom Cruise in the lead role. While Fincher was at the helm, Josh Hartnett was to play Bucky Bleichert, and Mark Wahlberg was to play Lee Blanchard, although the latter had to drop out due to scheduling conflicts with the remake of The Italian Job. He wanted Juliana Margulies as Madeline and Jennifer Connelly as Elizabeth. At some point during production, Fincher eventually left the project, feeling he was unable to do it the way he wanted, and directed Zodiac instead. Brian De Palma would go on to direct the film film, with Hartnett still in the lead role, Aaron Eckhart as Lee Blanchard, Hilary Swank as Madeline, and Mia Kirshner as Elizabeth. It would go on to receive mixed to negative reviews from critics and audiences, and was considered a major disappointment after the great LA Confidential. The next film is The Mexican. After finishing Fight Club, Brad Pitt got the script for The Mexican and thought Fincher was perfect, so he gave him the script. Fincher loved it and wanted to direct it, but he was too busy. It eventually went to Gore Verbinski instead. It received middling reviews. The final film for the 90s, well, kind of, is Spider-Man. Believe it or not, Fincher was considered to the point he met with executives for the feature. The ideas he had were that it was going to follow an older Spider-Man who would have his entire origin story as a montage in the first 10 minutes, which also included the death of Gwen Stacy by the Green Goblin, who was going to be the main villain. He said it was going to be more grounded and character-driven with more of a drama-oriented story. Allegedly, he wanted Edward Norton to play the older adult Spider-Man, but that was only a rumor and not confirmed. When Fincher met with executives, they hated his ideas and ultimately passed on his pitch. Eventually, Sam Raimi was chosen and the rest is history. Ironically, the more character-driven, grounded, and drama-oriented version would be used for The Amazing Spider-Man, which would go on to star Andrew Garfield, who also appeared in The Social Network, directed by David Fincher. Maybe they went back to the drawing board and remembered his pitch. Who knows? Cut Short also had a video on this going into a bit more detail. Moving on to the 2000s, we have Passengers. Not the Chris Pratt and Jennifer Lawrence film, a totally different one. In 2000, David Fincher was to adapt the Robert Silverberg short story from 1969. Michael London was producing and Greg Pruse was set to write the film. The budget was going to be $30 million. Sometime in 2002, Fincher walked away from directing duties, but was looking for a replacement. Nothing has been heard of since. Next is Catch Me If You Can. Fincher was actually attached to direct this in 2000 for a few months until he dropped out to direct Panic Room instead. Steven Spielberg would go on to direct the film to glowing reviews from critics and audiences. Next up is Squids. Fincher purchased a David Ayer script about a coming-of-age story set on a Cold War submarine. It never made it past this point, and Ayer stated in 2012 that the script sucked anyway. Next is Pathfinder. Fincher was apparently attached to direct this film in 2000 about a CIA agent who has to stop his former cellmate from blowing up stolen plutonium. Nothing ever came of it. The next film to talk about is They Fought Alone. In August of 2000, Fincher was in talks to direct a film based on Colonel Wendell Fertig, with William Nicholson writing the screenplay. Fincher stated he still wanted to direct the film in 2009, with Brad Pitt wanting to play Fertig, but nothing ever came of it. Next is Seared. Fincher was set to adapt Anthony Bourdain's memoir, Kitchen Confidential, in 2000, with Brad Pitt interested to star and Benicio del Toro interested in a role as well. Art Linson was set to produce. It was to be filmed when Fincher was done with Panic Room, but it never got off the ground. It was eventually adapted in the form of a loose adaptation, only inspired by the novel, as a TV show with the same name, with Bradley Cooper starring as a character based on Bourdain. Believe it or not, this is not the last time that Fincher would lose out on a restaurant kitchen film where Bradley Cooper would end up starring, but we'll get into that soon enough. The next one we have is Chemical Pink. In March of 2001, Fincher was set to adapt the Katie Arnaldi novel of the same name. Art Linson was producing along with Fincher, and Arnaldi would be adapting her own novel. It was to be about the bodybuilding world and how widespread steroid use was, based on Arnaldi's own experiences in bodybuilding. Although there was a rumor that Chuck Palahniuk would be writing the screenplay, but I couldn't find a proper source of this. Due to unknown reasons, Fincher would then exit the project and Jonas Åkerlund would direct instead. However, the project would never see the light of day. Next, there is Hard Boiled. No, this is not an American remake of the Hong Kong film of the same name, but an adaptation of the Frank Miller miniseries of the same name. In August 2001, David Fincher was announced to direct the film, which was to have Nick Cage star in the film as well as producing it under his company, Saturn Films. However, it just never happened. In 2008, Miller stated he was going to be directing the adaptation himself. Then in 2013, Mukunda Michael DeWill was set to adapt it. And then finally in 2016, WB was working on getting the rights to the comic. Ben Wheatley wanted to direct with Tom Hiddleston set to star. However, none of these adaptations ever went anywhere as of 2025. The next film we have is Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. Nothing too crazy, crazy, just that George Clooney stated Fincher was one of the many directors considered for the project. Believe it or not, the next one we have is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. In December of 2001, Walden Media bought the rights to the Chronicles of Narnia series, and the producer, Philip Anschutz, stated that he met with many director candidates, one of them being David Fincher, who approached him to direct the first film in the series. But Andrew Adamson was ultimately chosen to direct the film instead. But David Fincher directing a kids movie? That's a scary thought. Although not gonna lie, with his deal with Netflix, he should have been the one to direct the series, since Greta Gerwig is already running it into the ground. Then for another franchise film, we have Mission Impossible 3. Surprisingly, before J.J. Abrams made his directorial debut, Fincher was in consideration to direct the third outing in the franchise. Apparently, Tom Cruise himself wanted Fincher as the director of the film. So he had some meetings with executives and producers about the direction of it. The only thing that was known about it was that Fincher wanted to make the film extremely violent. However, he would eventually pull out when he realized that he wouldn't be putting his own stamp on the film. When doing an interview a couple years after the film came out, he had this to say: "I think the problem with third movies is the people who are financing them are experts on how they should be made and what they should be. At that point, when you own a franchise like that, you want to get rid of any extraneous options. I'm not the kind of person who says, let's see the last two, I see what you're going for. You'll never hear me say, whatever is easiest for you." As I said, Abrams would helm the film instead, and while we got a good film, it was a movie that killed the franchise for the next 5 years, so take that as you will. The next film is the reincarnation of Peter Proud. Fincher was attached to the adaptation of the Max Ehrlich novel, which was also going to be a remake of the 1975 film adaptation of the same name. He was in negotiations in 2002, with officially becoming director in November of 2009. It was initially at Paramount in 2002, but by the time Fincher was attached in late 2009, the rights went to Columbia. It was to reunite Fincher with Seven screenwriter Andrew Kevin Walker, and it was set to come out in 2016. The project remained dormant. Another adaptation was ignited in 2021 from Village Roadshow and David S. Goyer's Phantom 4, with Sean Durkin writing and directing, but nothing ever came of this film adaptation either. Now we have Stay. The David Benioff spec script was to be helmed by David Fincher, the news coming from Benioff himself, but Mark Forster ultimately directed the film instead. Next is Lords of Dogtown. After Fred Durst, yes, that Fred Durst, left the production of the film in 2003, Fincher was hired to helm the project. However, he then left the film over budgetary concerns and philosophical differences with Sony. Catherine Hardwicke directed it instead. Another big one: the Deadwood pilot episode. According to Fincher, he was 2 millimeters to saying yes to directing the pilot because he loved David Milch's teleplay. But ultimately, Walter Hill, producer of the Alien franchise, funnily enough, would go on to direct the episode and would win the Emmy for Outstanding Direction because of it. Next is Lookout. In 2003, it was reported that David Fincher was going to be directing a film written by Scott Frank for DreamWorks. It was a spec script, and Fincher had developed the script with Scott Frank. Eventually, Fincher dropped out, which caused DreamWorks to get cold feet, and they dropped the project as well. It was then picked up by Miramax, and Frank would go on to direct the film himself, with Fincher's contributions appearing in the finished film. It would go on to receive positive reviews. Another big one is The Time Traveler's Wife. In 2004, Fincher was interested in directing the adaptation of the novel of the same name, but Robert Schwentke was chosen instead. The next film is The Dirt. Rich Wilkes wrote the adaptation of the Motley Crue biography of the same name, with Fincher planning to direct, but Wilkes stated that it got blown apart somehow, and Fincher went on to direct other projects. Fincher, however, would hire Wilkes to work on his ill-fated Videosyncrasy show, which we will get into soon enough. Next up is a big one, and that is Torso. In 2006, David Fincher was announced to direct the adaptation of the graphic novel of the same name, written by Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Andreyko. It is about Elliot Ness and his team trying to hunt down and capture the Cleveland Torso murderer. A couple years after he was signed on, he stated that it was, quote, not going to be a serial killer film. It's about the deconstruction of the myth of Elliot Ness. It has more to do with Citizen Kane than it has to do with Seven. Aaron Kruger wrote the script as well. In 2008, Fincher said it was not to be a very faithful adaptation of the source material. People were rumored to be cast in the film, although their roles remain unknown, just that Matt Damon, Rachel McAdams, Casey Affleck, and Sir Gary Oldman were possibly set to be in the film. If I had to take a stab at it, no pun intended, was that Damon was probably set to be Ness. However, Paramount let the rights relapse in 2009. 4 years after this, a new adaptation was greenlit, this time with David Lowery directing and writing. Then 4 years after that, Paul Greengrass was then set to direct, with Brian Helgeland writing. However, nothing has ever come from this either, although Bendis remains hopeful that the project will see the light of day. The next one is Second Lives. Fincher hired Peter Strawn to direct the Tim Guest novel of the same name, but nothing ever came of it. Next, believe it or not, is The Terror. David Kajganich penned a screenplay based on the novel in the late 2000s, and Fincher was going to direct it. However, the project fell through. Eventually, Kajganich would serve as the showrunner of the TV series based on the novel, which received high praise. Just like Tim Burton, we have the Fight Club Broadway musical. In around 2008, Fincher stated he wanted to readapt the novel for Broadway for the 10th anniversary of the film. But unlike Batman the musical, it never got far and was only an idea. Speaking of Chuck Palahniuk, the next project we have is Lullaby. Fincher wanted to adapt his novel of the same name, but it never came to be, with Fincher even stating he would have to dumb it down for its film form. The next one is Black Hole, not a remake of the famous Disney film of the same name, but an adaptation of the Charles Byrne graphic novel of the same name. In 2008, Fincher was set to direct, but dropped out in favor of directing the adaptation Girl with the Dragon Tattoo instead. After finishing that film, he was reported to helm the project again in 2013, but that never came to be. Rick Famuyiwa was reported to direct the film in 2018, but again, it never happened. Big franchise one next with Heavy Metal. Fincher and possibly James Cameron were set to produce an animated remake / readaptation of the Heavy Metal film / magazine. It was set to have at least 8 segments, with Fincher and Cameron each directing a segment, along with Zack Snyder, Kevin Eastman, Tim Miller, and Mark Osborne. Guillermo del Toro and Gore Verbinski expressed interest in directing a segment as well, although it was also reported that they were confirmed to take part, in addition to Jeff Fowler and Rob Zombie. Tenacious D were set to write a song for the film, with Jack Black himself appearing in Osborne's segment. Paramount Pictures, though, just decided to straight up stop funding the film by July 2018 at the earliest and August 2009 at the latest. No other studio showed any interest, and the project stalled indefinitely. Apparently, the alleged reasoning that nobody wanted to touch it was because it was considered too risque for mainstream audiences. 2 years later, Robert Rodriguez purchased the rights, truly and officially killing this version of the project. However, this version would never be made either, as 3 years later, Eastman, who was an editor and publisher of the magazine, revealed he sold off Heavy Metal and that the deal with Rodriguez fell through because of that. Tim Miller, and to a lesser extent David Fincher, eventually retooled the project when Netflix became interested, and since they were unable to use the rights for the magazine, it eventually became Love, Death, and Robots. It would premiere in 2019 and receive universal acclaim, albeit with its latest season last month getting weaker reviews than previous seasons. Although before Love, Death, and Robots became a thing, both Miller and Fincher considered making Heavy Metal after Miller directed Deadpool, as he now had a newfound popularity, but both decided against it and just took it to Netflix since they had the freedom there. The next one is The Automatic Detective. In July 2008, Fincher acquired the rights to the A. Lee Martinez novel of the same name. Nothing ever came of it. Then another one we have is The Devil in the White City. Eric Roth stated that Fincher was interested in directing his adaptation of the novel of the same name, but nothing ever came of it. The next one is Chef, not the Jon Favreau film, but a different one. Fincher was doing an interview stating that he wanted to do a film based in the culinary world, and it would star Keanu Reeves. However, by 2010, it was considered dead. John Wells would then revive the project in 2013 and have it be more of a comedy film starring Bradley Cooper, aka the movie I was talking about when talking about Seared. To avoid confusion with the Favreau film, the film was changed to Adam Jones and then finally to Burnt. It was released in 2015 and would receive negative reviews from critics and audiences. Then the final one for the 2000s is Columbine. Fincher considered directing the adaptation of Dave Cullen's novel of the same name in 2009 based on the shooting in 1999, but the idea was dropped due to the sensitive nature of it. It would eventually be adapted into a play in 2014. First of the 2010s is the Lone Wolf and Cub film trilogy. Apparently Fincher, along with Andrew Kevin Walker and Tim Miller, were set to work on an adaptation of the Lone Wolf and Cub manga, after Darren Aronofsky failed to get it off the ground in the early 2000s. They pitched it to Universal and they accepted. Fincher planned to shoot it photorealistically using CGI to recreate medieval China. I assume similar to the look of the Polar Express. However, the reason this was cancelled was because Universal failed to clear the rights to the story. With this, Fincher moved on to other projects, while this lay dormant until 2017, when Justin Lin became director. However, this time the project was at Paramount, and nothing has been heard since. Next is Nerdland. Fincher was attached to direct the Andrew Kevin Walker script Nerdland, which was planned as a live-action indie film. Many actors came in to do read-throughs of the script like Zach Galifianakis, Bob Odenkirk, and John Ennis, who would have a part in the finished film. Fincher would eventually move on to other projects, while Chris Prynowski would direct it as an animated feature where it was released on video on demand in 2016. It received overwhelming negative reviews despite a very well-known cast. Next, we have Pawn Sacrifice. It was announced that the long-dormant biopic about Bobby Fischer was going to be helmed by Fincher, produced by Tobey Maguire and Gail Katz, with a script by Stephen Knight. However, it is unknown as to why he dropped out. Edward Zwick replaced him as director. An interesting one we have is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. In mid-2010, Fincher was all set to direct an adaptation of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and specifically a remake of the Disney film. Scott Z. Burns was writing the screenplay, and Brad Pitt was eyed to star, but he declined. Film received a $20 million incentive from Australia as well. However, due to production problems, he would leave the project in mid-2013. It was revealed that it was because of casting disagreements with Disney. Fincher wanted Channing Tatum for the lead role, while Disney wanted Chris Hemsworth. Next up is Cleopatra. In 2011, Fincher was attached to direct the film, with Angelina Jolie starring as the titular ruler. Eric Roth was writing the screenplay. However, in August 2012, Fincher left the project. Next one is a pretty obvious one with The Girl Who Played with Fire. It was announced that after the success of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Fincher planned to adapt the other two Millennium novels, The Girl Who Played with Fire and The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest. They would be filmed back to back. It went through various scripts written by both Steve Zaillian and Andrew Kevin Walker. 4 years after the Dragon Tattoo film came out, the next novel in the series, the first not written by Stieg Larsson, The Girl in the Spider's Web, was released. After it was released, Sony opted for a reboot to the series with said novel, hoping to use succeeding novels for sequels. Eventually, The Girl in the Spider's Web was released in 2018 with Fede Alvarez at the helm and Claire Foy replacing Rooney Mara as Lisbeth Salander. It was a huge box office disappointment and received overwhelming negative reviews, with the exception of Claire Foy's performance, which was the only thing praised. Believe it or not, the next film is the untitled Queen biopic. In the early 2010s, Sacha Baron Cohen was trying to get a Freddie Mercury biopic off the ground, but it was ripe with production problems, mainly with Cohen and Queen butting heads on the direction of the film. Cohen wanted a hard R showcase of the rock star's life, while Queen wanted a crowd-pleasing film that would be more of a showcase of the band than Mercury. Fincher was one of the many directors considered for the project, along with Tom Hooper and Stephen Frears. Fincher, seeing test photos of Cohen as the rocker, campaigned hard to direct the film, but was rejected by Queen. Eventually, by 2013, Cohen left the project because they couldn't reach an agreement. The project would then evolve into a mashup of Cohen's and Queen's ideas, more so the latter, in the film Bohemian Rhapsody, starring Rami Malek in the lead role, garnering him his first Oscar. Talk about wasted potential, though. Big project with the first of David Fincher's HBO deal with Videosyncrasy. HBO greenlit David Fincher's Idiosyncrasy for 10 episodes, sometime prior to 2015, with him directing some of the episodes. It was about a guy named Robbie who drops out of college and moves to Hollywood in 1983 in the hopes of making a sci-fi epic, but is now a PA for a company that makes music videos, with it now being a huge industry. The first season was to start with filming the music video for Berlin's The Metro and concluded with the filming of Thriller. It was set to star Charlie Rowe as Robbie, with Sam Page, Jason Fleming, Harry Condon, Elizabeth Lale, Corbin Burnson, and Paz Vega as the supporting cast. It was written by Rich Wilkes, which I mentioned before, and Bob Stevenson. It was actually a half-hour comedy series, and it had already filmed 4 to 5 episodes before HBO pulled the plug, Wilkes comparing it to something like Entourage or Veep. The only information in terms of the cancellation is that they saw some of the completed episodes. According to some sources, it was because David Fincher was retooling the direction of the show and it was only getting a break, but it's also possible that HBO didn't like the direction. It never got resurrected though. Next is Utopia, the second series part of the Fincher HBO deal. Fincher was interested in making a remake of the British cult TV series Utopia. He and Gillian Flynn began working on the series at HBO, and they gave it a series order. Fincher was going to direct all the episodes of the first season, with Flynn writing it. However, in 2015, they canceled it due to budget concerns, with Fincher saying it was a problem over $9 million. It would have starred Rooney Mara, Colm Feore, Eric McCormick, Dallas Roberts, Jason Ritter, Brandon Scott, and Agnes Dean. 3 years after the fact, the series would be picked up by Amazon, and Flynn was still on board as creator, showrunner, and executive producer. It would eventually be released in 2020 and received mixed to negative reviews due to the poor timing of the COVID-19 pandemic, with a virus ravishing the world being the focal point of the show. It was canceled after 1 season of 8 episodes. Next is Steve Jobs. Fincher was the first choice to direct the biopic of the Apple co-founder and entered discussions in February of 2014, but bowed out in April due to contract disputes. It would then be directed by Danny Boyle. Next is the film Red Sparrow. In 2014, Fincher was apparently interested in directing the Eric Warren Singer screenplay adaptation of the novel of the same name. He wanted Rooney Mara in the lead role. However, the film would eventually be made in 2018 with Francis Lawrence directing, Justin Haythe writing, and Jennifer Lawrence starring. Another huge franchise one was actually the Star Wars sequels. In late 2014, Fincher actually discussed with Kathleen Kennedy about doing episode 7. He wanted to make it like Empire Strikes Back, and that he saw the series as the story of 2 slaves, C-3PO and R2-D2, who go from owner to owner, witnessing their master's folly, the ultimate folly of man. Of course, this would not happen, but many years later, Kennedy offered him a chance to direct episode 9, but turned it down because he was uninterested in franchise filmmaking due to pressure from everyone involved. J.J. Abrams would go on to direct both of them. The final HBO deal TV show that never made it was Shakedown. David Fincher was set to direct this show written by James Ellroy. It was going to be set in the seedy underworld of 50s tabloid culture, with the protagonist set to be Fred Otash, a real private investigator and Hollywood fixer. Unfortunately, this never made it to air either, with the third and final TV show part of Fincher's deal with HBO not making it to air, along with Idiosyncrasy and Utopia. Next is Strangers. Apparently in 2015, Fincher was going to team up with Ben Affleck and Gillian Flynn once again for a modern update of Strangers on a Train. Flynn was going to write, and it was assumed that Affleck was going to star. It was going to be produced by WB, but all 3 were overcommitted for the time, so it wasn't going to happen anytime soon. Apparently, it was reported that Fincher was going to update the story, with it initially taking place on a private jet, hence why the on a train part was removed. And Affleck was apparently playing a movie star in the middle of an award season, campaigning for a role he was in. His plane breaks down and is offered a ride to LA by a wealthy and mysterious stranger, and the plot goes on from there. However, it resurfaced in 2024 when it was revealed that Fincher signed a new deal with Netflix, and that was the next film he was making. Affleck was now apparently only loosely involved, and it's alleged that Fincher was going to bring it back to the train setting. It is unknown if Flynn is still writing this script, script, and if it's once again going to be happening now, since Fincher's next project is now the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood spin-off. For the penultimate project of the 2010s, we have World War Z 2. In 2017, Fincher was hired to direct the sequel to the hit zombie film. It was set to start filming in June of 2019, but was canceled in February of that year by Paramount. Apparently, the popularized reason was because China banned films that featured zombies and ghosts. Which doesn't make a ton of sense because it wasn't filmed there, nor was the first film released there due to a scene saying that the virus originated in China. Maybe Paramount was hoping that the sequel would get more money there since they like stuff like this. I'm not totally sure, but that was the cited reason as to why they canceled the sequel. Pretty dumb, but studios, they don't make sense. Then for the final project of the 2010s, kind of a big one, is the untitled Chinatown prequel series. In late 2019, Netflix finalized a deal with Fincher and screenwriter Robert Towne to develop a prequel series to Chinatown, focusing on a younger version of the J.J. Gittes character played by Jack Nicholson in the film. Fincher was going to be the showrunner and executive producer alongside Joshua Donnan. Fincher stated he was still attached in 2021, and 2 years later, it was rumored that Henry Cavill took a role in the show. Last year, Towne stated that all the episode scripts were written and that Fincher had wanted Tom Pelphrey as the young Gittes. However, nothing has been heard of since. Now we get to the 2020s, with the first being Bitterroot. In September 2024, Fincher was attached to direct the film Bitterroot, a Western crime thriller for Netflix. The film was set to be about an elderly rancher who gets gypped out of $1 million sweepstakes, which turns to him robbing banks and hunting down the thieves. He is also being pursued by the sheriff, who just so happens to be his son. The screenplay was written by Michael Gillow, and it was on the Hollywood blacklist since 2008, with the original title Big Hole. Not that great of a title. Production was set to begin in January of this year, but it was put on hold so Fincher could direct the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood spinoff. Only time will tell if this will actually get made, as it is still a possibility unlike other films and projects on this list. The final project we have is Rope. The same month, it was reported that Fincher was working on a number of things for Netflix. One was the Squid Game America spinoff, which is still in development. The next was the Chinatown prequel, which we already talked about. And then finally, a crime thriller film, which was revealed to be a remake of Rope. Stephen Knight was set to direct a draft of the script, with Charlize Theron set to star, along with Denzel Washington rumored to star alongside her. Considering this was the most recent film to be talked about less than a year ago, it is entirely possible that it is still in development, just like Bitterroot. But that is it for now. Damn, what a video. I hope you liked that. Definitely won't be doing a director's cancel projects video for a while. So on to the next, which will hopefully be a cinematic reimagining, but things can always change. See you then.